The Undocumented Railway Series, Book 4, Mid Sodor Engines. Dear friends, many years ago there used to be another narrow gauge railway on the island of Sodor. It was once the second biggest railway on the whole island, running from the seaside town of Alsborough to the bustling city of Pilgodred. Being such a big and important railway, it comes as a shock that it was ever closed in the first place. But then, I suppose that's the purpose of this book. Here I will tell you what happened that eventually led to the railway's downfall. The director. Story 1. We'll do what we can. Once upon a time, there were 7 little engines who lived in their own little shed on their own little railway. Their names were Duke, who was brown, Stanley and Albert, who were both red, Falcon, who was blue, Stuart and Jim were green, and lastly there was Tim, who was black. Each engine had a different role to play. Jim and Stanley pulled goods trains. Duke, Falcon and Albert often took the passengers. Stuart did a bit of both, while Tim took the miners to work. They didn't always get on with each other, but they loved their home. No matter what, they always tried to get their jobs done to the best of their abilities. Well, at least most of them did. One morning, the engines were getting ready for work. Stanley, the railway's biggest engine, was having his fire built up by his fireman, while his driver pulled out a pack of cigars. He put one to the engine's lips and lit it. "Must you do that inside, Stanley?" Duke snorted indignantly. "Yeah, come on, Stanley. I've got a boat train to take later," huffed Falcon. "I don't want to be smelling like smoke in front of my passengers." "You're a steam train, bud. You always smell of smoke," Stanley replied in his droll tone. He didn't even bother making eye contact with the 2 engines. He took a big pull and exhaled, right in Stuart's face. Stuart coughed and spluttered, while his driver quickly opened a window. The other engines decided to just leave it. They all knew how Stanley was in the morning. Just then, Albert's driver and fireman came in. They climbed atop their engine and began to polish his brass. "What's going on here?" Albert questioned. "We've been asked to take a special train," his driver said. "Apparently some big business types from Pilgodred are coming to survey the railway this afternoon," the fireman added. Albert was delighted. "Ha-ha, and I have been chosen," he boomed. "Guess you could say I'm how you say, moving up in the world." He said that last part looking directly at Stanley. Stanley just ignored him. The other engines all sighed. This was all Albert would talk about for the rest of the morning. "Taking these passengers is a big responsibility, Tim," Albert told the little black tram. "It's very important that they have a fine journey." "Oh, is that so, Albert?" "Oui, big city types like that, and the fate of the whole railway could be in their hands." "Really?" Tim stuttered. "Which is why the manager asked me. I am the main passenger engine on this railway after all. An expert in my field." Tim's driver pulled the lever, and Tim puffed rather worriedly away. "Could these men really shut down the whole railway?" Tim asked his driver. "Of course not. Albert just likes the sound of his own voice. We have nothing to worry about, Tim." Tim hoped his driver was right. Later, Stanley was waiting to leave the shed so he could start work. He was off to the mines to collect some coal trucks and take them to the top station, King Ulrich's Bridge. Just then, Albert ambled up alongside. "Can you believe it, Stanley? I am taking the special train." "I know, bud. I was right next to you when we got the news," Stanley said flatly. "I don't blame the manager at all. I mean, look at me. I am a work of art. I'm like the pinnacle of French engineering." Stanley let out a long, loud sigh. That's crazy, man. "It's such a shame you can't pull important trains too. Always stuck on your little mining ones." "Albert, I'm gonna be frank with you. I do not care," Stanley replied very bluntly. He then spat out into a nearby bucket. The hot water sizzled and popped as it made contact with the bucket surface. He then puffed grumpily away, off to the mines. Albert was cross. "The trench engines are not fun," he grumbled to himself. Stanley tried not to show it, but deep down he did care. Albert had a habit of really getting on his nerves. He rocked and rolled down the line. His driver, who was still quite new to the job, was being thrown about in the cab. Whoa, relax, Stanley, he cried, his voice cracking as they went over a bump. Stanley just snorted in reply. Now, before Stanley came to the Mid Sodor Railway, he used to work on a trench railway during the Great War. He had been built for that railway, and so had been exposed to constant violence from a very young age. Stanley would tell you that it toughened him up. The others would tell you that it made him rather unpleasant to be around. The poor engine was a bit of a nihilist. When Stanley arrived at King Always Bridge, he shunted his coal trucks onto the siding and went to fill up on water. On the platform, he noticed a group of smartly dressed men. "Oh, those must be the passengers that Albert was talking about," said Stanley's driver. "Is that so?" Stanley murmured. "Hey," he called to the smartly dressed man, "are you the guys to be surveying our line?" "Why, yes," replied a man with a thick pair of spectacles. "If you don't mind me asking, but, why?" "We're the board members of the new power station on the other side of town," explained a larger man with a big monocle in his right eye. "The plan is to supply an easy means of power to the whole island." "That's right," put in another much shorter man with an overly tall top hat. "It's going to be hydroelectrical." What now?" "It means that we're going to use water from the nearby lakes to generate electricity," the man replied grandly. "In order to finish the power station," the man with the thick spectacles added, "we need a railway to transfer all our equipment over. We're having a look on your railway to see if it's possible." Stanley grunted. "Well, the only thing I have to say is, good luck with that." The men all looked at each other with concern, but before they could ask a follow-up question, Stanley's driver interrupted the entire conversation. "Your tanks are full now, Stanley. Let's get going." He hopped back into the cab, and Stanley puffed away. He chuckled to himself as he left. Those nerds obviously weren't shoved into enough lockers growing up. About a half hour later, Albert steamed into the station, pushing in a fancy saloon coach, painted in chocolate brown with gold lining. "Bonjour, monsieur," Albert called to the men. "My name is Albert, and I shall be your engine for today. Step aboard, and I shall show you the whole railway, from top to bottom." The men were quite impressed. Just then the carriage door swung open, and out stepped the manager, Mr. Abraham. "Hello, crew. Welcome to my railway," he announced with great showmanship. "Salutations, Mr. Abraham," said the man with the monocle. "Thank you for having us." "Oh no, thank you, sir," the manager replied as all three men stepped aboard. "I think you'll find our line is exactly what you're looking for." Murmured the shortest man, the last to step aboard. Mr. Abraham hurried into the coach, the guard blew his whistle, and Albert puffed grandly out of the station. Meanwhile, Stanley had collected another goods train, and was now rocking and rolling down the line. "A power station indeed, a power station indeed," he snorted to himself. "What a joke." "Slow down, Stanley. We're not running a race," screeched Stanley's driver. Stanley just chuckled and continued to charge recklessly down the line, swaying from side to side. It was quite easy for him to do so. He had been built as quickly and easily as possible for the war effort, and so he had many design flaws. For starters, he wasn't even gauged properly, and had a habit to slip in between the rails. Another issue was his big side tanks. If one tank had more water in it than the other, it put him off balance, causing him to rock about even more. Unfortunately, nobody had remembered to warn Stanley's new crew about this, and now Stanley's tanks were dangerously off balance. This would quickly prove disastrous, as Stanley entered one of the many tunnels along the mountain road. As he rocketed through, Stanley suddenly swayed violently to the right. His tank caught onto the side of the tunnel wall. It scraped and scratched as it made contact. Stanley wailed. He wasn't laughing now. His driver fought for control. He slammed on the brakes, but that only made things worse. Stanley bumped and bounced, his wheels slipped between the rails, and he came right off the track. He soon stopped, leaning on his side against the tunnel wall. "Oh well, that's torn it," Stanley's driver cried. "It would have to happen on today of all days. Oh, I'll go and get help." Stanley's driver walked out of the tunnel and went to alert the previous block post, while his fireman quickly dropped the fire. He then hurried out of the tunnel, as it began to fill up with Stanley's smoke and steam. "Isn't this just great?" Stanley coughed. Albert puffed gallantly down the line. He was very pleased with himself. The men from the power station sat in the coach, taking notes while Mr. Abraham was standing up, giving a not-so-great tour on all of the railway's landmarks. And if you look to your left, gentlemen, you will see another tree. And if you look over there, a rock. And coming up to our left, we have... But he got no further. Suddenly, with no warning, Albert stopped sharply with a jerk. Mr. Abraham fell to the floor, while the gentlemen bounced around like bobbleheads. Albert had stopped sharply next to the block post. The signalman stood nearby, bringing down the red flag he had been waving, and putting it away into his back pocket. "Oh, what's going on here?" Albert cried. "It's Stanley," the signalman explained. Mr. Abraham jumped to his feet at an instant when he heard that, and scrambled outside to find out what was going on. He hoped the men from the power station hadn't heard the signalman too. They had. "He's gotten himself stuck in the tunnel," the signalman went on. "We'll need you to head up there and take his trucks back to the next passing loop." "But I've got my special terrain," Albert complained. "It's alright, Albert," Mr. Abraham interrupted, trying his best to look like he had control over the situation. "We'll just take them back to the previous station and Actually, we'd like to come too," said the man with the spectacles. "Yes," spoke the short man with the tall top hat. "I want to see this for myself." Mr. Abraham gulped. "Surely you gentlemen wouldn't be interested in all that," he chuckled. No, said the large man with the monocle. "This could very well be an insightful thing for us." Mr. Abraham was livid. If he could, he would be screaming right now. Fortunately, he didn't have to, because Albert, on the other hand, didn't hold back how he felt. "That American idiot!" he grumbled as he stormed away. When Albert arrived at the tunnel, he was coupled onto the back of Stanley's train and awkwardly puffed back to the last station, pulling the trucks in front of him and pushing the saloon coach behind. Everyone needed to wait for Stanley's boiler to cool and for his smoke and steam to clear before it was safe to re-rail him. It was a very long wait. All the while, the men from the power station stood nearby, taking notes. It made Mr. Abraham feel most uncomfortable. Eventually, Stanley's boiler was cool enough, and it was safe to re-rail him. The works train soon arrived, being pulled by Jim. The workmen wasted no time in getting to work. The smartly dressed gentlemen were most fascinated. "Can we help?" asked the man with the thick spectacles. "I'd hate you dirty your suits, gentlemen," Mr. Abraham insisted. He just wanted the day to be over. "Nonsense, we insist," said the man with the large monocle. And they got to it. Using jacks, Shunter's pole, and much manoeuvring, they finally got Stanley back on the track. "I tried to warn you," he whispered darkly to the smartly dressed gentleman. The men either looked at each other or down towards the ground. It was clear they had much to think about. Jim took Stanley away back to the works, while Albert returned with the saloon coach. He was excited to get things back on track. "And now that that's all taken care of," he boomed, "shall we continue the journey?" "I'm afraid that won't be necessary," said the short man with the top hat. "We need to get back to Pilgudred." "Oh, come now, monsieur, there's still so much to see." "No, thank you, Albert," said the man with the thick spectacles. "It's been a long day. Let's just get going." They all hopped back on board the coach. Mr. Abraham gave Albert a sort of anxious look, as he too hopped back in. Albert had never seen the manager look so worried before. The journey back was quiet. Albert could hear the men and the manager chatting away inside of the saloon. It was quiet and hushed. Albert could tell whatever they were talking about, it wasn't good. When they got back to King Maurice Bridge, Mr. Abraham waved the men goodbye. He looked absolutely miserable. "What happened, monsieur?" asked Albert. Mr. Abraham sighed. "Those men were here to survey our railway because they're planning on opening a new power station," he told Albert. "They were hoping that we could help with delivering their equipment up to the site. Unfortunately, they've decided our line is too narrow for what they need." "Oh no," Albert whined. "What's going to happen now?" Apparently they were also making a deal with the Northwestern Railway in case things fell through. No doubt they'll build a new standard gauge line going up towards the town. "What?" Albert cried. "But they can't. Pilgudred is our town." "Well, looks like we'll have some competition," Mr. Abraham said, defeated. His brow then furrowed and he scowled. "Let's get back to Arsdale," he murmured darkly. "I need to have a word with Stanley when we get back." The other rangers were devastated when they heard the news. "How could you be so stupid, Stanley?" Jim cried. "The railway's in serious trouble thanks to you," put in Stuart. "Lay off, squirt," Stanley retorted. "Don't talk to Stuart like that," Falcon snapped. "This is a disaster," Tim cried in his overdramatic manner. "What are we going to do, Grandpuff?" Everyone turned and looked at Duke, the railway's oldest. Many engines had come and gone from the Mid Sodor. but Duke had outlasted them all. He'd seen everything, and with that experience came wisdom. The old engine thought for a moment, before returning his gaze to the others.
We'll do what we can.